Welcome to a very special edition of the Pensari Basketball YouTube channel's weekly edition. We're going to be talking everything Raptors, from the draft of Christian Koloko, the offseason pickup of Otto Porter Jr., re-signing Thaddeus Young and Chris Boucher, the terms of those deals and what they mean for the Raptors. And we're going to talk some Kevin Durant rumors as well. We're going to look at some mailbag questions that came in a few weeks ago, and hopefully we'll tackle the ones that aren't outdated already. So let's start with the signings. So the Raptors are a few days removed now. Free agency has started, and we've seen some crazy deals being offered, and they're really not that crazy when you factor in the new CBA that's going to be coming up. But let's talk about the Raptors specifically and what they've gotten. So they've re-signed Chris Boucher. The terms of the deal are roughly 3 years, $35 million, a very reasonable contract. It's movable, right? Chris Boucher obviously has been hit or miss, has spent plenty of time in Nick Nurse's doghouse over the years, but it really seemed that towards the end of the year, and specifically towards the second half of the season, especially after the addition of Thaddeus Young, that he seemed to find a groove as a role player, and he finally stopped chucking as mercilessly as he usually does. Shot selection was just a little bit better. His defense started to really hone in on the defensive end, and he was a beast on the offensive glass. And to be honest, if you're a buyer into the analytics, and obviously analytics will always favor bigs like Chris Boucher, active rim running bigs, by a lot of measures he was their best player in the playoffs, and he was definitely the most consistent. He really did play very well, and I think at the age of 30, right, you're pretty much signing him towards the tail end of his prime at this point. I think he'll earn that contract. I think it's a good get for the Raptors. Now, Thaddeus Young, terms of the deal were a little bit rich. There were some rumors that it would be 2 years, $10 million, right? And we ended up at 2 years, $16 million. But look, I think people need to realize that when these deals are initially reported, they're usually not being reported by the team. They're being reported by the agency or the agent or the player themselves. Typically, when these deals are reported, you're going to see them represented as a little bit higher. I think we saw this last year with Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan, where like the deal was $390, and it turned out it was less. So let's wait for that. I do believe that a lot of the $16 million on Thaddeus Young's deal is going to be in terms of contract incentives. So I do believe that the deal will be closer to $213.5. And I think that that's fair value for a guy like Thaddeus Young, who, despite, being 34 years old to the start of the next season, is still a very productive role player. He's a switchable big. He's a small ball five. You can plug and play, solid passer. What I like about Thaddeus Young coming back is the impact that he's had on this young Raptors roster, specifically on Scottie Barnes, Precious Achiuwa, Chris Boucher, and of course OG Anunoby, whom he's known since he was a kid through his AAU team. And I think that it's really interesting just to see how those, specifically the four players who really gravitated towards Thaddeus Young, just seemed to pick it up after that trade. And if that type of intangible quality is there, that sort of teaching, mentorship mentality, then I think that could be sort of an amplifying effect for the rest of your roster. So you might be looking at Thaddeus Young and saying, well, what's he really going to give you over the life of this contract? Well, for starters, there's a couple of value adds immediately. Number one, it's a contract extension, not a new signing. So immediately it's a contract that's movable right away. You don't have to wait 3 months, 6 months, whatever. You can trade it right now. So he could be part of a bigger deal going out right now, and they might already agree to something like that. Second, it's the type of deal where it's short term. You still maintain your flexibility, and I think that signing Chris Boucher to a 3-year contract also maintains some level of flexibility. The Raptors roster is about to get really expensive with the Fred VanVleet extension, potentially the Pascal Siakam extension, OG Anunoby extension. Eventually, over the next 4 years, at some point, you're going to extend Scottie Barnes to what's likely going to be a mammoth contract under the new CBA. Things can get really pricey really fast, especially if you have a core of players, all young players, that are all looking to get paid. So I like the fact that the Raptors kept their flexibility. Now, their free agent signing of Otto Porter Jr., I think, had a lot of people confused, but in a good way. positively confused, because I don't think that most people thought that the Golden State Warriors would let him go. So a few things about Otto Porter Jr. that I think that some Raptor fans may not fully appreciate, because they might be looking just at his numbers from last year, which is, I think, that a trap that a lot of people fall into when they look at how good is a player. Well, does he score 15 points per game, or does he score 8 points per game? And I'm going to like him more if he scores 15 points per game. But if you look at Otto Porter Jr., in terms of the skill sets that he provides, number one, per crafted box plus minus model, he is in fact a 90th percentile defender across the board. Now, granted, a lot of the mobility is gone due to the injuries. He's a little bit heavier. He's rehabbing. He's had a disastrous 4 years in terms of injuries since his days in Washington. But that being said, he's a very good defender, especially as a 4-5. So a small ball 5, I think immediately what this move means is if he's healthy, those Khem Birch minutes are gone, and they're going to go to a guy who not only is a very good defender in the 90th percentile, also a career 40+% shooter from 3. So this addresses almost immediately every single problem that the Raptors had on their bench last year, which is a lack of shooting, a lack of defense, a lack of experience, right? And if I know Nick Nurse as well as I do now, 3-4 years of watching him coach, he seems to really trust his vets. He wants guys that he can trust, guys who don't make a lot of mistakes. And Otto Porter is definitely a guy who doesn't make a lot of mistakes. He's a very smart vet. In fact, sometimes little known fact that when Thaddeus Young and Otto Porter Jr. were in Chicago at the same time, they were actually both elected to be co-captains of that team. And that's a few years back now. But it just shows you that a lot of what I really appreciate about Thaddeus Young, minus the shooting, is a lot of what you're getting back with Otto Porter, which is a multi-positional leader, a champion, a guy who makes winning basketball plays. And if he's healthy, given that Spotrac just reported that he just signed with the Raptors for a veteran minimum, I think most people, when they heard that we'd signed Otto Porter, immediately assumed that we had signed him on a 1+1 for the mid-level exception. If he signed for the veteran minimum, that is the greatest signing in Raptor history. That is the greatest offseason signing in Raptor history. And we're talking Damari Carroll, Hedo Turkoglu. Like, it's not a good list. Landry Fields, Aaron Baines. This is not, you can go through the history of the Raptors offseason every single year. It's a disaster every year. It's either a massive overpay on a very unfavorable contract term, and it blows up in our face, and we have to package a first-round pick just to get off that contract within a year, or it's a very underwhelming player that you overpay, and it's a glut of underwhelming, reclamation projects like we did with Rondae Hollis-Jefferson and Stanley Johnson. So to get a guy like this, whose services are very much in demand across the league, whom I'm sure the Golden State Warriors definitely wanted him back. They offered him a veteran minimum, right? So if he's healthy for you, this is a steal. Like, it's absolutely, I don't want to go over the top and, exude hyperbole and say it's the best offseason signing. But for the dollar amount, relative to what he provides, and I'm going to go into a little bit of what he provides, this is an incredible signing for the Raptors. So let's talk about a little bit of what he provides by the numbers, right? 3.1 box plus minus, okay? So if he was on the Raptors last year, that number, 3.1, is third on this team behind Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam, which means that per box plus minus and various other analytic models, including Raptor, including win shares per 48, basically anything you could look at that measures basketball impact beyond the box score, he was pretty much the third best player or the fourth best player on the Warriors last year. Didn't play a ton, right? Occasionally started for the Warriors, so it's not like he was buried at the end of the bench. He was the seventh guy in their rotation last year. Occasionally started. I think he did play 63 games. He started 15 of them. He had a major part to play in their title run. He was a really serviceable big off the bench when they wanted to go small. He's an incredible rebounder. Okay, I think that's something that maybe a lot of people don't realize about him is he's an incredible rebounder. He's a bit of an underrated passer as well. If you're telling me straight up, if he's healthy, he's a better player than Chris Boucher and Thaddeus Young. So if you really got him on a veteran minimum, your bench just went to the next level. Okay, so now that we move off of free agency and what I think that the Raptors have really done with their bench, let's talk a little bit about the Christian Koloko draft. Okay, so I was on the record saying that the Raptors were really high on Peyton Watson. And until I hear otherwise from the front office, I do believe that they were. When Peyton Watson went off the board a little bit earlier than expected, and a lot of people are going to eat crow for clowning that pick, I assure you, I promise you, I've watched this guy play for a long time. He's really good. Once he went off the board, they went for a guy that they didn't even work out. Now, that's pretty impressive. Now, if you really think about it, what does that say, right? They couldn't get him into a workout because of the visa issues, right? They went for a guy that didn't even work out. That might sound scary to you. If you're a Raptor fan out there, you're saying, whoa, I know that the Magic drafted Paolo Banchero without working him out. And I know that Jabari Smith Jr. did not work out for the Houston Rockets. So workouts are not everything. Obviously, there's plenty of data on these players. These teams have tracked these players for 4 or 5 years. They've watched them play. You don't need to work the guy out. But it's ideal that you work them out. You have a sit down, you meet with them, you take them out to dinner. All of these things are ideal, right? Before you invest a draft pick in someone. So I want to talk about why they were so confident in Christian Koloko and why I think Christian Koloko might be a little bit better than a lot of draft pundits probably think that he is. So Arizona, right, for all of their greatness, because they were one of the best teams in college basketball in the Pac-12 last year, and Benedict Mathurin, right, Dalen Terry, right, this was a stacked team. Christian Koloko, in my opinion, was the best player on that team. Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? The Benedict Mathurin would be picked 6th, but this is where we're at with the devaluation of bigs. He was the defensive player of the year in the Pac-12. Pac-12 is not a joke. If you're a college basketball fan, you know that, right? So what are the limitations and what would have caused him to slip? Well, I think first is the perception that he's older, right? At 22 years old, he's not going to draw the same upside comparison, this dreaded word of upside, as someone who's 18 or 19 years old. There's just going to be a perception that he's closer to peaked, right? Which I don't think is necessarily true for players who have his pipeline or path line. And what is his path line? Well, it's a player who picked up basketball a little bit later in life, right? Christian Koloko has not played organized basketball since he was 8 years old or 9 years old, like a lot of players in college basketball. He actually picked up basketball much later in life as a soccer player. And to have a guy who came to a new country, that's always an adjustment, right? To a new culture, culture shock. There are a lot of players, international players that I've talked to that have said that adjustment of moving to a new country usually takes a year. So he moved to the States, played high school, went to Arizona. First year, he was shooting 37% from the free throw line. By the last year, which is the last year that he just had, he was shooting 73, 74% from the free throw line. What does that tell me? That tells me this is a guy who works, okay? His analytics jump off the page to me. His work ethic jumps off the page. When he was describing at his media availability that he's shooting 1,000 shots a day, the first thing I thought was, it shows. It showed. Every year it showed. This is a guy who's hungry to get better. This is a guy who fits your locker room. He's humble. He's humble. He's a good kid. He's a really good kid, right? And he's a defender. So why would the Raptors have had Peyton Watson above him? Well, first of all, Peyton Watson's probably a more special athlete. He is younger. The upside is probably a little bit higher. But I think also part of it is because they didn't get a chance to work him out. Had they had a chance to work him out, I think they would have fallen in love with him. And I'll tell you why. Spoke to a couple of scouts who were down at the combine who actually did watch him. And one of the things that I heard from one of them was that his passing game, short roll passing, might be one of the most underrated parts of his game. So a lot of people who think that he's Clint Capella, in all the years that I've watched Clint Capella from the Rockets to the Atlanta Hawks, has never flashed real ball handling, feel, passing, shooting. It's just never been his game. He's an incredible rebounder, incredible shot blocker, rim runner, efficient, dunks. He dunks in the dunker spot, but he doesn't do much beyond that, right? What I think you have in this guy is something a little bit closer to Serge Ibaka. Now, that's high praise. Okay, Serge Ibaka was a borderline all-star, borderline defensive player of the year, a guy who at one point commanded multiple picks Domantas Sabonis. I mean, the Orlando Magic were absolute idiots for that package that they gave Sam Presti. But, this is a very valuable player type, right? So a lot of people would say if you got anything close to Serge Ibaka at the 33rd pick in this draft, you hit a home run here. I believe the Raptors have hit a home run. The only reason I believe that Peyton Watson and players like that were a little bit higher on their board is just because of the player type. I think that this team is all in on this 6'9", switch everything. And for everything Christian Koloko is, it is yet to be seen. I mean, he thinks he can guard 1 to 5. It is yet to be seen whether he can stay in front of guards. Now, Nick Nurse, in his media availability, said that they're going to play a little bit more drop. They see him as a drop big. I think this is a team that probably just watched what Robert Williams did in the playoffs for the Boston Celtics, and it was very impactful. Having a guy who can basically shut down a part of the floor for you, which in this case is the paint, is very invaluable. And what Nick Nurse mentioned that I think was very relevant was that it allows you to be even more aggressive on the perimeter. So suddenly all those passing lanes that you're gapping, you're not worried so much about a blow-by because you have this guy behind you who's just shutting the paint down. So you can run guys off the three-point line way more aggressively, right? And this deterrent in the paint that you just didn't have last year, okay? You didn't have a shot blocker last year. Chris Boucher, for all of his greatness, is not quite Christian Koloko as a shot blocker. Doesn't project that way. Thaddeus Young, Scottie Barnes, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, none of these guys are scaring guys away from driving into the paint. And the Raptors did give up a lot in the paint. So you have this guy who effectively deters offensive players from driving straight to the paint. Well, suddenly the opponent's shot diet is a lot of mid-range shots, a lot of short pull-ups. And I think that's a lot better than going right into the basket to the most efficient shot in basketball, which is an open dunk or an open layup. So I think that the Raptors get better with this draft pick. Now, on to Ron Harper Jr., right? The Raptors' first Filipino player, and the son of Ron Harper, Chicago Bulls legend Ron Harper, Cleveland Cavaliers legends, prior to that, Ron Harper. I think this is an awesome pick. I watched him at Rutgers. Reminds me a lot of Gary Trent Jr. If you haven't watched my draft video where I evaluate all 58 picks, go check that out. It's on this channel. It's a very interesting pickup. I really like it. I like a lot of what I like in his game is his creativity, his physicality. I see a lot of Grant Williams in him. A little bit of that, right? Shooting, right? He gives you a lot of shooting. There's a lot of 3-and-D potential there. And I think that a lot of teams are going to regret passing on him in the second round because I tell you, there are a lot of players who were picked in the second round that will never sniff an NBA rotation. And with Ron Harper Jr., I'm not telling you that this guy's going to come in and play minutes for you next year. But this is a guy who has a chance. He has the physicality, the tools, the game, the feel, the pedigree, all the right stuff that makes an NBA rotation player. So this is just another guy that the Raptors can develop through their pipeline. And if history is any indication, I think they're going to do a pretty good job with him. So now moving on to the Kevin Durant stuff. Now, I've had a lot of anxiety, over the last few days because I really don't know what. It's a little uncertainty, right? I'm very attached to a lot of guys in this roster. And I have to be realistic here that if you have the chance to get Kevin Durant for the right package, that this is something that you don't have on your roster, which is a superstar. For everything Pascal Siakam is, he's a top 20 player. But if you listen to Shaq, there are 4 superstars in the NBA. I could liberally say there's more like 7 or 8. But Kevin Durant, until further notice, is on the cusp of that, at the tail end of that, even at 34. Okay, he's 33 right now. He'd be 34 when the season starts. So what does that package look like? So there are 3 options really here, right, if you're the Raptors. Option number 1, build a package around Scottie Barnes. That package is probably going to include Gary Trent Jr. because of the salaries, because he's your least relevant and least valuable, least long-term additional piece. And you're going to have to add some salary to it. So you're going to have to add Khem Birch. You're going to have to add Thaddeus Young. You might have to add a few picks. To me, this is a non-starter. Okay, I am not trading Scottie Barnes for a 34-year-old Kevin Durant. Not only is he my favorite player, I would never do it. Okay, and I know a lot of people who are saying, you're crazy, Rob. I mean, Kevin Durant plus Fred VanVleet plus Pascal Siakam is a guaranteed championship. No, it's not. No, it's not. So we'll get into why it's not, but I'm not even thinking about trading Scottie Barnes. So if not thinking about trading Scottie Barnes, well, then the next one up is Pascal Siakam, because that's your second most valuable trade piece, which is Pascal Siakam. So what does a package around Siakam look like? Well, it's probably going to include Pascal Siakam plus Khem Birch plus Malachi Flynn plus maybe 2 picks, 2 swaps, something like that. Because as much as Pascal Siakam is coming off of a rebound year, there's a lot of extra value that Kevin Durant has for being Kevin Durant. I don't necessarily love that, but that's one that I could actually get behind, because Kevin Durant, even playing 55 games, is a massive improvement over Pascal Siakam. I think this is something the Raptor fans maybe need to get behind and maybe understand, that the gap between the 7th best player in the NBA and the 20th best player in the NBA is enormous. This is not soccer. This is not football. This is a sport in which one guy really can win you a series, win you a game, win you a quarter. And Kevin Durant is that guy. And until further notice, Pascal Siakam is not that guy. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Raptors can't be really good with Pascal Siakam. But the Brooklyn Nets are in a very precarious situation. They have to be good next year. They're not allowed to be bad. For the next 4 years, they're not allowed to be bad. Because usually when teams are bad, they're rewarded with lottery picks. The Brooklyn Nets don't have their lottery picks. They have pick swaps, and they have outright missing picks for the next 4 years as part of the James Harden trade. So the option of even trading for a young player like Evan Mobley or Scottie Barnes, neither one of these guys is by themselves carrying you to the playoffs. Scottie Barnes plus Ben Simmons plus role players doesn't bring you to the playoffs next year. As good as I think Scottie Barnes is, you need more. You can't just keep giving up 7th overall, 6th overall, 5th overall. God forbid you give up the 1st overall pick next year because you're that god awful because Ben Simmons decides now his knee hurts. The Brooklyn Nets need impact players back for Kevin Durant. I know that everyone thinks that they're going to get back 15 picks, but those 15 picks don't help you, because most of those 15 picks are going to be going to a team that's going to be pretty good with Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant's a hell of a basketball player. He's going to get teams to the playoffs. He's not missing the playoffs. Those are not lottery picks. But the picks you're going to surrender if you suck for the next 4 years are going to be lottery picks. So that being said, I think that if I'm the Raptors, I start with Pascal Siakam and I play hardball on the picks. The third option here is OG Anunoby plus Gary Trent. Now this could work. This could work. It's a little risky, but it could work because you're giving up 2 core pieces, one of whom may not even be in your cards, one of whom definitely is in your cards, but is a very valuable role player. I don't know if the Brooklyn Nets do that. I don't think they're getting enough back in that case. As much as I love OG Anunoby and he's my second favorite player on this team, I don't think you're getting enough back. Even if you add players like Precious Achiuwa or Thaddeus Young or picks to that package, I don't think that OG Anunoby plus Gary Trent plus Ben Simmons and whatever you get for Kyrie Irving, which it won't be much, by the way. Kyrie Irving, with all of his problems on an expiring, is not going to get you much. So what do you really have if you're the Brooklyn Nets? I think that you have to go for that Pascal deal. One thing that having Ben Simmons on the roster does complicate for the Brooklyn Nets is that they can't have another guy who was signed using the same rookie max exception that Ben Simmons was signed with. So you can't have Bam Adebayo. You can't have Devin Booker. You can't have Jamal Murray or Michael Porter Jr. if you wanted him. If you wanted to ask the Nuggets for a 2-for-2 swap and give them something, you would have to give them Ben Simmons back in the deal in order to absorb either one of those guys. You can't ask the Miami Heat for Bam Adebayo. The other thing that I think maybe a lot of people don't realize here is Kevin Durant has shown a very clear pattern. He's willing to quit. He's my favorite player, one of my favorite players of all time. I've loved Kevin Durant since he was at Texas in 2006. He was my favorite player for over 10 years. I watched almost every game he played. From Seattle to OKC, I rooted for this guy. He will quit. He will quit on you. If he does not feel like you put a roster around him that he can win with, he will quit. He's chasing rings at this point. So if you have to gut your roster, as some people have suggested, Pascal Siakam plus OG Anunoby, if you have to gut your roster that way to get him, I'm sorry, but he's not winning here, and he's not staying where he's not winning. You got to consider that. Any team that is going to trade for Kevin Durant right now cannot gut their team. The only real threat to do this, to be honest, apart from the Raptors, are the New Orleans Pelicans and I would say the Phoenix Suns, if they can package DeAndre Ayton, which I don't think that the Nets are super eager to do. But if you're the Brooklyn Nets, really the three options you're considering here, potentially, if the Pelicans are willing to move off of Brandon Ingram, is Brandon Ingram plus stuff, or Pascal Siakam plus stuff, or DeAndre Ayton plus Mikal Bridges. Those are your three options if you're the Nets. You're not getting Tyler Hero and enough stuff to make that work, and that's not, that offer, no matter how many picks you add to it, is not making you better than having Pascal Siakam next year. The compromise that maybe might work, depending on how high they are on Seth Curry versus how high they are on Gary Trent Jr., is Gary and Pascal for Seth Curry and Kevin Durant. The other option that's been thrown out for the Kevin Durant sweepstakes is the Los Angeles Lakers, because of course the Los Angeles Lakers find their way into every trade rumor. What are they offering? They're offering an Anthony Davis who hasn't touched the basketball in 4 months. By the way, he just picked up a basketball 2 days ago, so I stand corrected. And Russell Westbrook, arguably one of the worst 100 players in the NBA last year, paid like a superstar, not on an expiring contract, still owed a lot of money. And they're going to take back Kyrie Irving, who's the best player in that deal, quite frankly. No disrespect to Anthony Davis. Last year, he was horrible. And Kevin Durant. I don't see it. The Lakers don't have the picks. The only three teams that have the assets to really do this, the Pelicans, the Suns, and the Raptors. If I was a betting person, I would say Kevin Durant probably ends up a Pelican. I don't know what the Blazers could offer. They could offer every pick under the sun. I don't think it's going to make a difference. Next year, they can offer Shaedon Sharpe. It's not going to make a difference. I'm very curious to see what happens. But one thing I am almost 100% sure of is that Scottie Barnes will be a Toronto Raptor on opening night, and Evan Mobley will be a Cavalier on opening night. So let's get to some mailbag questions before we end this. Istvan asks, what if anything do the Raptors want to change in their game/players for next season? I think that they want to get a little bit deeper at the backup point guard position, and whether that happens through development of Delano Banton or Malachi Flynn, or whether that happens through a trade or veteran free agency, I think that was a really big hole in their roster. I think that they really want to consider possibly having a backup big that could play against bigger matchups, and I think they may have addressed that with Christian Koloko. I think, honestly, I'm going to take Messiah at his word. I think that they really like where they are. I think if you really consider where this team was in the second half of the season, once you erase the rough start, this team, as was with Thaddeus Young, is probably on pace to win 50 to 52 games. You can't argue that the East is going to be decidedly better next year. There's going to be a lot of teams tanking next year because there's a really big prize in the draft next year. You can expect some teams to just bottom out. The Charlotte Hornets just lost Miles Bridges for nothing, right? That's a team that's going to bottom out. So even if you can say Atlanta's going to be better, New York's going to be better with Jalen Brunson, there are a lot of teams that are going to be worse too, probably including the Brooklyn Nets. So I think the Raptors stay the course. They bank on internal development. They fill some of the ancillary pieces as they've done with Otto Porter Jr., hopefully pray for some internal growth from OG Anunoby, Scottie Barnes, Precious Achiuwa, all of whom should be much better players this year. Hopefully hope for some health for Fred VanVleet. And by the way, the Raptors missed an incredible amount of games last year from their roster. I think a lot of that had to do with freak luck, but some of that had to do with just the load of minutes that the starters were playing. By having a deeper team with Thaddeus Young now in tow instead of Goran Dragic, who wasn't playing for you, having Otto Porter Jr. if he's healthy, having maybe one of those younger pieces that weren't quite ready last year, like Justin Champagnie, who was really good last year, or Delano Banton, who was good in spurts last year, or a Malachi Flynn, who has flashed some moments of potential throughout his 2 years. Just having those guys, maybe Chris Boucher buys into a more regular role. Maybe OG Anunoby stays healthy for over 70 games. I think a lot of upside on this roster you could see is from the continuity. Also, I'll point out that I think the Raptors could be a lot better just by being familiar with each other. Last year, there's a lot of new pieces, right? Scottie Barnes was new last year. Precious Achiuwa was new last year. You were implementing young players. Scottie Barnes is not a rookie anymore. And Precious Achiuwa has come a long way. So, I'm not saying the Raptors are going to be a 60-win team this year, but they could be. Demille asks, what is a realistic package that we can ask for OG Anunoby? Well, if reports are to be believed, what the Raptors were asking for from the Portland Trail Blazers was a number 7 pick, which inevitably they would have used for Dyson Daniels, and a future first and something, which in this case was either Josh Hart or Nasir Little. So it's basically a prospect / roster filler that's serviceable, that they can play, a very young prospect or a high lottery pick in a fairly deep draft. It's not a top heavy draft, and a future first. That's a pretty big haul. They're approaching the territory of what the Bucks had to pay for Drew Holiday. And they see OG Anunoby as that type of player, and I don't think that he's going to move unless it is for Kevin Durant or something like that. I think the Raptors really believe in OG Anunoby. I think that they see him as a guy whose career has been derailed a little bit by injuries and unfortunate events, the appendectomy, his father's passing. I think the Raptors still believe in OG Anunoby. I think he fits. I think he's the prototypical 3-and-D forward. I think if he's healthy, he has another gear in his game. I'm not necessarily a buyer in all that Kawhi stuff that I was maybe 2 years ago, but his handle came a long way last year. Mid-range scoring came a long way. Still a very poor isolation scorer, but I think he can work on it. He can get better, and he's an all-world defender. Slightly overrated in that sense. Sometimes it's a bit of a reputational defender, but in terms of the scheme that the Raptors run, can't imagine a more impactful player who can play 1 through 5. He really is the only Raptor that I can honestly say without question can guard 1 through 5, because even the other guys who think they can guard 1 to 5 might struggle with 1s or with 5s. He can actually guard 1 through 5. That's an incredible value for a team like the Raptors. So I think it'll take a lot. Demille also asks, what happens if we move Fred for draft capital and young prospects? What would a realistic package for that be? I'm just going to answer that by saying, number one, the draft has passed, so I apologize. You asked this question a few weeks ago, but I don't see that happening. I think that Fred VanVleet, even though I'm not the hugest Fred VanVleet fan, is a very important part of this team going forward. I think if you're looking at what the New York Knicks just did with Jalen Brunson, this value of having a steady, consistent force, even though he's a little bit vertically challenged in certain matchups, is invaluable. It's a steadying force. I think for the Raptors, it's a really big part of their culture. There are a lot of undrafted and late first round, second round picks that come into this team each year. And to have this example there of this guy who made it from undrafted to all-star, it's an incredible intangible to have. So I think that Fred VanVleet might just mean a little bit too much to the Raptors to let go of. An advanced metrics lesson. Well, we'll do that in another video for sure. Dan Grinbergs asks, will David Johnson make the team next year? I don't know about that. Sorry, Dan. I had some questions about David Johnson coming out of Louisville. He hadn't really shown a great upside or trajectory of getting better year over year in Louisville, and I think he struggled a little bit last year too. I would say I'm a big believer in his talent. I'm not a huge believer in his mindset, and this is coming from someone who's never talked to David Johnson, so I do apologize. I have just to say that there are moments in a game where he overthinks, or he might have some bad habits, or he zones in and out sometimes, but he's talented as hell. You know, he was at one point last year when we were looking at the early mocks, he was mocked as high as 18, 17, 20, 22. It just so happens that he slipped, and I think there's a reason he slipped as far as he slipped. Obviously, people were not super sold on him being a first rounder and wanting to commit that type of salary to him. And now he finds himself in a precarious situation where he really was the rookie who was the odd man out last year. Delano Banton got minutes. Scottie Barnes led the team in minutes. Justin Champagnie showed some really great flashes, and I think that there's a really good chance he's back. But David Johnson was sort of the odd man out. So I would say that this is the type of player that has a lot of skill. He's physical. I like his paint finishing. I would like to see him back. But it's really hard to argue at this point that there's a decidedly great gap between him and Ron Harper Jr. So I think if a push comes to shove, maybe those two guys are battling for a spot, and then the other guy just either hangs around in the G League with the 905 or moves on to another team. There's only so many of these guys that you can really have on your roster, and I think that they're both pretty... Well, I won't say they're similar because David Johnson is a jumbo guard and Ron Harper Jr. is more of a switch everything 1 through 4 defender. I don't know. It's going to be one of those two, I think, for that final spot. It'll be interesting to see in camp. Doe asks, how are the Raptors going to approach Freddie's Supermax extension next season? Will or should they go after a center on draft night? Sorry, again, late. Or via trade or free agency or none? Should the Raptors offer signing bonus attract more? This is a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to tackle the first one, which is how will they approach Fred VanVleet's extension? I think they're going to give him a fair deal. I think that you should believe or be a buyer in the 4-110 figure that's being floated around there. Look, the analytics would say that he's a night and day better player than Jalen Brunson. Also happens to be 3 years older than Jalen Brunson. Also, maybe the perception around the league, just given how his body broke down in the playoffs, given the fact that he's undrafted and there's all these stigmas about that. I think that his perception, the perception of value around the league and among GMs is that he's slightly better than Jalen Brunson. So if you believe that Jalen Brunson just signed 4 years, 104, I think Fred VanVleet pretty much signs 110. I'm kind of hoping they front load this deal just because of how scary some of these extensions are going to look coming down. But the salary cap's going up. I think it's going up by $12 million this year. Maybe in a couple of years, maybe in 3 years, we're looking at a $25 to $26 million player, and we're saying that's $10 million above the mid-level exception. So I think that Fred VanVleet has some value. Personally, I'm not a huge fan. I understand the value he brings. I think that the creation is a little bit weird. I think his fit on this roster and the role that he played last year might be a little bit over his head. So given that his comments were that he's willing to take a step back if it makes the team better, I really hope that he sticks to that, because I think Scottie and Pascal creating more off the top and playing sort of point as he floats more to an off-ball spacer, I think that'll make the Raptors a lot better. So if he's willing to buy into that vision of this being Scottie and Pascal's team and not his team going forward, then I wouldn't mind, because we've seen John Wall get traded, right? We've seen Russell Westbrook get traded, and Fred VanVleet is better than those players at this current moment, and he's basically commanding half of what they're commanding. So I think it's a fair value for the Raptors. It's really hard to imagine them moving on from him, given all that he's meant to their organization. So that's where I'm all on that. Pineda asks, is there any chance to get Gasol back? I think he'd be happy to come back. He loves Toronto. Unfortunately, Pineda, Marc Gasol has been pretty much washed for 3 years now, and I don't see him coming back, although there was some joke I believe from Bobby Webster or Dan Tolzman, about how they had kept tabs on him and maybe considered bringing him back for one of the playoff series. Look, I would like to see him back in some capacity within this organization. I think his role in the parade and his role in the championship made him an instant Raptor legend among Raptors faithful, and Raptors fans would welcome him back with open arms. Not with a roster spot, though. I think it would be great to have him back as a development coach. No offense to Jamal McGlure. Love Jamal McGlure, but having a big man who's really played at the highest level is probably going to be a future Hall of Famer. It would really help, I think, to develop some of the big man skills, the passing and all that stuff, the footwork. I think it would be really great to have him back in some capacity, but not as a player. Dave asks, touch on Raptors salary cap situation. Too many fans have all these unrealistic trade situations or free agent signings. What is Chris Boucher's value? Do we sign him? If so, at what price? Well, now I'm going to seem like Nostradamus answering this in hindsight. How do we best fill the roster if we stand pat and make 0 trades this offseason? Again, sorry, this question was asked 3 weeks ago, so I do apologize that I'm answering this a little bit late. But in terms of the cap situation, the Raptors are they're a cap team, right? They're over the cap. They're operating as over the cap. They have their mid-level exception this year, right? And if they have not used that mid-level exception on Otto Porter Jr., now I'm going to read the tea leaves. Now, according to Sport Track, his signing is a veteran minimum. I think this may be wrong. I would be very surprised if it's a veteran minimum, because Toronto is a pretty high tax market, and it would be very hard to imagine that he couldn't have commanded much more from another team. I do know that his wife is from Toronto, so that was a really big part of why he wanted to be here, and he's made over $100 million in his career. He's a very highly paid former lottery pick, so maybe money's not a huge thing for him. Maybe it's all lifestyle right now, and maybe he did sign for a veteran minimum with some, I don't know, wink deal that the Raptors would take care of him later, or let him play fewer minutes, or maybe not play very much until the playoffs. It's entirely possible, okay? It's entirely possible that something like that was arranged. Chris Boucher and Thaddeus Young were both signed with the bird rights. I think the cap situation going forward is not necessarily very scary. I think the Raptors are below the luxury tax. Now, if you know anything about the CBA, obviously there's a repeater tax, so you really don't want to be stepping into luxury tax territory unless you're really willing to contend. The Raptors went into the luxury tax when they were contending with Kawhi, and then they quickly dipped out of it. Right? So you don't want that repeater tax, because then you end up pretty much where the Golden State Warriors are right now. And, there aren't a lot of owners who are just willing to pay 500% on a contract just to appease somebody, right? I think there was, what was it? Kelly Oubre Jr. cost the Golden State Warriors something like $80 million the year that they had him, and they didn't even make the playoffs. So that's crazy, and I don't necessarily support that type of reckless spending. But at some point, if you're the Raptors, you're going to have to make a decision on Gary Trent Jr. What do you do with him? You're going to have to make a decision on OG Anunoby. Is this a long-term player for you? Because he is signed to a very team-friendly deal, and he's a clutch client. They're both clutch clients, actually. Gary Trent Jr. and OG are both clutch clients, and they're both going to, want more touches at some point. I know it's been a big talking point this year. In the offseason, and they're also going to want more money than they're currently making right now, right? Gary Trent Jr. can opt out after the next offseason, right? And the Raptors they have his rights, they have his early bird rights, but they do not have the option to match anything. So he can just outright leave, okay? You could lose him for nothing because he's not a restricted free agent. You don't have a right to match. So, and you can't extend him beforehand, right? So he's in a very strange situation because he signed that 2+1 deal. OG Anunoby, you can sign to an extension if I'm not mistaken, and Pascal Siakam is eligible for an extension this fall. So, look, depending on that, I think, and Precious Achiuwa, right? That's another player who's going to eventually come up for an extension. He's on a rookie deal. Scottie Barnes. Look, if you play this out 5 years, you could be looking at a nightmare cap situation. If you extend all of these guys, right? I mean, you could be talking about $170 to $180 million roster. That's ridiculous, and I don't think the Raptors are willing to go there. So one of these guys is going to be on their way out. At some point, it's going to have to happen. Thankfully for the Raptors, they have this pipeline of young players that they always seem to develop, right? These guys who come up behind the players. So you look at a guy like Justin Champagnie. What are you going to sign him to? Well, this offseason, you could sign him to a 3-year deal if you really like him, right? Maybe he offsets some of that. Maybe you have a draft pick that comes up 2 years from now that you're really high on, and you believe that by the year 4 years from now, that guy is going to be ready to contribute, and that way that guy might replace Fred VanVleet. Something along those lines. So I think the Raptors have done a great job under Masai Ujiri and not screwing themselves over by super long-term commitments. They tend to play it in 3-year chunks, and they'll give up more in the interim. They'll give up more dollars right now to maintain the flexibility of not having to have a 4 or 5 year contract. And I think that that's something kind of cool about the Raptors. So I don't necessarily think the Raptors are headed for cap hell, but I don't see a way that you can keep all 6 of Precious, Scottie, OG, Gary, Fred, and who am I missing here? Scottie Barnes? Wait, Precious, Scottie, Siakam, right? All 6 of those guys. Because at some point, all of those guys figure to be making over 20 million. Yes, I am very high on Precious Achiuwa now. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Thierry asks, what offense are we even running, and why is our pick and roll trash? Good question. The Raptors are not running any sort of offense whatsoever. No, I'm just kidding. They run a lot of high pick and roll. Clearly there's a lot of liberty within the offense because the defense is so complicated. And in order to get buy-in on offense, they run a pretty simplistic, in order to get buy-in on defense, they're running a very simplistic offense. And sometimes it does look messy, and sometimes it stalls. And this high pick and roll, short roll for Scottie, or, isolations for Gary, or, it's not necessarily like some sophisticated offense that they're running. What I am going to tell you is that this year, now that the guys who needed to learn the defense, most of them are still here and they've learned the defense, expect the offense to take a really big jump this year. And I'm not just saying that because Otto Porter Jr. is here and he's a great shooter, or because I expect some monumental rise from OG and Scottie and Precious, which I do expect those guys to get better. But I think that because the defensive wrinkles have already been worked out, I think you'll see more sophisticated offense, more sets run. I think you'll see a little bit more motion, which I think was really lacking last year. Not a lot of off-ball movement. So, all right. Carol asks, do we need a big at center? And if so, what do we have to give up? So, Carol, I don't know how you're defining a big. So is Christian Koloko at 230 pounds and 7 feet with 7'5" wingspan a big? If so, then I think it's a nice to have. Do I think that if you swapped Christian Koloko right now for a 6'8" Robert Williams or a 6'8" Kevon Looney that you wouldn't be way better next year? Of course you would. These extra inches are irrelevant. Look, I want to consider this from the inverse. I don't think height is super important at the center position. I think weight is super important. Strength and weight are super important at the center position. Where I think height is important is at the guard position, because your playmakers as guards, if they're super short, no offense to Fred VanVleet, sometimes there's certain passes that they just can't see over. There's guys with long arms on them. They can get stopped really easily. In the post, do I really mind having Otto Porter, Thaddeus Young, Scottie Barnes, and OG Anunoby be my center rotation? I don't really mind. There's like 2 or 3 matchups in the NBA that are going to be a really big problem. Yeah, am I a little bit worried about the rebounding? For sure. Possessions, this is a possessions game. And as long as the guy that you have in there can box out, again, set screens, it doesn't really matter how tall he is, right? There are a lot of guys out there who are 7'1", they can't do any of that stuff. Is having someone like Pokusevski or Chet Holmgren or something like that going to make you night and day better just because they're taller? No, not necessarily. I think length, width, strength, these things matter a little bit more than height. So I know that Raptor fans sometimes do get really caught up in one particular podcaster specifically makes a point to mention in every single podcast that the Raptors don't have a 7-footer. The Raptors don't have a 7-footer. Yeah, but look at the wingspan, man. I think it's like 7'4" for Scottie, 7'5.5" for Christian Koloko now, 7'3", 7'2", 7'3", 7'2", 7'1". It's crazy how long this team is. I think they're just so big, right? Especially when you run Scottie and Pascal at the 1, the type of lineups that you can run with this team, it doesn't really matter that there's not a 7-footer. But now that we have one, it's nice to have. Moving on, Kevin Bull asked me, for me, best case scenario is to trade. This is not a question. Moving on to Justin. Justin asks, who are the most realistic number 1 options the Raptors could pursue via trade? Examples, Kawhi, Paul George, or Bradley Beal. All right, let's take a second to think about this. Via trade, Kevin Durant. James Welsh asks, what should the Raptors trade for? What is the biggest need to win a championship? Do you believe in positionless basketball? Thanks for your question, James, and I know you can be watching this. What should the Raptors trade for? First of all, I think they should trade right now. If they get to the trade deadline, like let's just say they get to the trade deadline, and once again, like last year, they decide they're a little bit further ahead, right? A lot of this hinges on Scottie Barnes, okay? If Scottie can turn into the player that you might be envisioning in year 4 sooner, if he's a 22 point per game scorer next year, and Pascal Siakam's right, and OG Anunoby pops, well then now I think what you really desperately need is something along the lines of a poor man's DeJounte Murray who can shoot. Now, I'm not sure who specifically that player is, but what I'm talking about is a bigger playmaker off the bench. Okay, so not Derek White, but a bigger playmaker. Something like Malcolm Brogdon, but a better defender. Something, that player type, a guy who can create off the bench, run your second unit. Sort of like what Fred VanVleet was, but a better version of that when the Raptors bench unit, the bench mob, right? Because I think right now, someone like DeLon Wright, right? Someone like that I think the Raptors, I was really hoping would target him and as with a mid-level target. Because someone like that can really shore up the minutes. You're not in dire straits if Fred VanVleet gets injured. So I would like some veteran depth. So that's the first question you had. Second question is, what is their biggest need to win a championship? I think I just addressed it with that question. And do you believe in positionless basketball? Yes, I do. Eddie Duffy. Do the Raptors need to enter win now mode with all-stars like Pascal and Freddie in their prime? Or should the Raptors go young and look for trade deals to maximize our window with Scottie? Or should we do neither and stick with our core, believe in this roster development, and maybe fill it out with key role players, possibly including a starting or backup center? Interesting. Look, I think it's overstated that all of your players have to be the same age. They don't, right? That never happens. Pascal Siakam was not the same age as Kyle Lowry when they won a championship together. So clearly, as long as the guys that you're playing with and banking on are relatively close to their prime, either edging out or edging into their prime, it works. Obviously, you don't want a superstar contending team to go all in on a 20-year-old rookie. That's not what you want, because that's not going to work, because that 20-year-old rookie needs reps and he's not going to be able to get them. And that superstar-laden team needs veteran production, and they're not going to get it from this 20-year-old. So the thing with Scottie is he's 8 years younger than Fred and Pascal, right? So he's 7 years younger, I believe, because those guys just turned 28 and Scottie's turning 21, right? So he's 7 years young, 7 and change younger. I think the thing is that Scottie Barnes, right, he might be one of those players just because of how smart he is. He might be edging closer and closer to his prime. And I don't mean prime as in peak. I mean prime as in when he's really ready to be some version or some semblance of what he's going to become as a player. And I think given his work ethic, he might get there by year 2, year 3, right? He might start edging into his prime. There's sort of a misconception, I believe, that guys just exponentially get better for the first 5-6 years. They don't. Look at LeBron James, right? He did get better at a lot of things, but LeBron James was a beast in year 3. Luka Doncic. Has Luka Doncic really gotten so much better after year 2? Really look at it. Luka was 21 in year 2. So are we going to say that because Luka's 24 right now, that he isn't in his prime? Are these not his prime years? I'm pretty sure when you look back on Luka Doncic's career in 15 years, you'll count the years that he just had as part of his prime. Not all primes are going to be 26 to 32. That's just an average. There are a lot of guys who peak, who have a prime 24 to 28. Look at Vince Carter. Vince Carter did not have a single season in the NBA that was better than his 23-year-old season. He was not better at 29 than he was at 23. He just wasn't. He was a better shooter, but he wasn't a better player. So everyone peaks at a different time. I think Scottie is physically developed enough to enter his prime a little bit sooner. And if he does, then it's pretty hard to argue that Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam are going to be washed at 30, right? I mean, they could be, but it's unlikely. So going on the likely outcome, I believe that if this year goes well and the Raptors can get out of the first round, that the next year after that might be the year you go all in. And by all in, I mean the Raptors version of all in, which is you probably take a hit on a younger player and trade him for a slightly older player to expand your to shrink your overall window, but maybe expand your chance in the current window. So maybe that means, as much as Masai loves him, trading a guy like Precious Achiuwa, right, for a more established player, right? Maybe it means that getting off a really good young player for a really much better older player, kind of like what the Raptors did with Jonas Valanciunas and Marc Gasol. I don't think this Raptors front office is going to change what they did the last time too much. I think the only difference is that they're a little bit happier with the core that they have in place because they're the ones that put them in place. DeMar DeRozan and Kyle Lowry, Jonas Valanciunas, these were all Colangelo guys. These were all guys that Brian Colangelo added. Scottie Barnes, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, Fred VanVleet, these are all guys that Masai Ujiri added and Bobby Webster added. This is a completely different ballgame. I believe they think that they can win with this core. I really do. I really do. And I think that this team is going to go for it when the time is right. And I don't think the time is right now. But I think we'll see this team not sit on its laurels. And if they have to give up a couple of first rounders to get drastically better at a position of need, I think they'll do it when they're ready to. Moving on, John asks, who are the best options for another shooting guard using the mid-level exception? Gary Harris, Kobe White, Lonnie Walker Jr., DeLon Wright. Which of these centers would you prefer? Mo Bamba, Hartenstein, Thomas Bryant, or do you prefer picking up a center in the draft? Okay, once again, this question's a little bit dated. And you actually mentioned Koloko and Kessler and Orlando Robinson. Okay, so in terms of guards, I mean, I'll answer it anyway, right? I prefer Hartenstein. Like, if I could do the Raptors free agency, that would have been my number one target. And if I could have gotten Otto Porter Jr. for the biannual and Hartenstein for the full mid-level exception, I think the New York Knicks got him at a steal. I would have gone that direction personally. We'll see how he does in New York. We'll see if Randall is there long-term. In terms of guards, I know that a lot of these guys are now off the market. Lonnie Walker just signed with the Los Angeles Lakers. DeLon Wright is off the market. In terms of guards, I somewhat, and I know that he's not a great defender, but I like the Sacramento Kings pickup of Kevin Huerter. I think he's the kind of guard who can play 1, 2, 3. Most people would not classify him as a classic point guard, but I think he has a lot of creation and a lot of dribble ability, and he might be a jumbo point guard for you down the line at 6'7". I think that's the type of guy that I would have loved to see on the bench because he's got all these big, long wings defenders around him. So I don't think it's that big a deal that he's not a super great defender himself. I would have loved to see that, and I wouldn't have minded moving Khem Birch plus, I don't know what you would have needed because he makes $17 million. You would have had to move Khem plus maybe even Thad Young and something. But that would have been a target that I liked. Among the names that you mentioned, I like DeLon Wright. So that would have been interesting. Okay, so Sammy asks, it's a long shot thought, but I want to know, can Scottie Barnes, when it's all said and done, be considered the GOAT? Well, I'll tell you right now that if he stays, he will be the GROAT. That much I'll tell you. In terms of GOAT, I don't think so. I love Scottie Barnes. Is he going to be better than Michael Jordan? I don't think so. But I will tell you that I'm unusually high on Scottie Barnes. And the last time I was this high on a player was Kevin Durant in 2006. And I made a video entitled The Number 23. And I I guess it was based on the Jim Carrey movie, The Number 23. It's all about conspiracies of seeing 23 everywhere. And it was about how Michael Jordan had been picked after this generational center, 2 generational centers in Hakeem and Sam Bowie, and Kevin Durant had been picked 23, right after Greg Oden, and how it would be the same thing, and Kevin Durant would be this top 10 all-time player. And it's hard to argue that he's not a top 10 to top 12 all-time player. So even though I was young back in 2007, I think I saw it. And the last time I was really this high as I am on Scottie, on a prospect, it was actually on Kevin Durant. So do I think he'll be the greatest player of all time? No, I don't. I think that would be a very highly unlikely outcome. Do I think he could be one of the 25 greatest players of all time? Yeah, I do, actually. I think he's great. I really do believe that. Aaron asks, assuming that that he is well rehabbed and healthy, how likely is it that Freddie will gracefully accept a role as a catch and shoot guard without relinquishing the better parts of his leadership abilities and the great efforts he puts into on the ball defense? Good question, Aaron. To be honest, I think that in most situations, the cream will rise to the crop. Cream will rise to the top. Let me say that again. I think if Scottie comes out and he is just that good, right? I think it becomes almost impossible unless you are the craziest person and just irrationally, like Russell Westbrook level delusion, to just not fall in line, right? I think the writing is on the wall, right? Fred knows that he's not the best player on this team, even though he takes a lot of shots. And I think he would probably, if you really cornered him and forced him to answer, he would probably tell you that he's not the best player on this team. And there's really no reason. And everything he said in the interviews was he seems to think that he had to do this. And he's not necessarily wrong. There weren't a lot of three-point shooters or creators on this team. Pascal Siakam was missing and I think Fred showed a little bit of an ability to move off the ball in the playoffs and towards the latter half of the season as his shot wasn't dropping. The question is, when Fred gets hot, does Fred see other players? I don't think so. I don't think that Fred is ever going to be the type of passer, but if Scottie can become the type of guy that just the ball just finds like every possession because he's just that guy for you, then I think a lot of that takes care of itself. And to be honest, I think Fred VanVleet would be better off for it because his percentage is going to go up because Scottie is a great passer. And if Scottie can become the type of offensive player who draws a lot of double teams due to his size and post scoring, then I think that's going to lead to a lot of open shots for Fred VanVleet. So I really hope that what you're asking comes true. I hope that Fred VanVleet accepts a role off the ball. Tom asks, what players should the Raptors sign with the mid-level exception, or which position needs most addressing with this signing? So provided the mid-level exception is still open for the Raptors, provided that they used either the biannual exception or a veteran minimum to sign Otto Porter Jr. and the bird rights for Thad Young and Chris Boucher, I think guard, right? As much as I'm really high on the concept of Scottie Barnes being a point guard, and I do think naturally he's a point guard, doesn't necessarily have the greatest shot at defending point guards. And so whether or not he's a point forward for you going forward, because there's an old adage by Larry Brown, you are what you defend, right? So if Scottie Barnes is the point forward, then I need a big secondary playmaker at the point guard position. I wouldn't mind necessarily someone like a Derek White type, right? I've already mentioned it earlier, which is like Malcolm Brogdon, Gary, a guy like that, DeLon Wright, just a big playmaker. I would like a big playmaker in the backcourt if that's possible. If the Raptors believe that Delano Banton can become that, and they believe he can become that soon, then that's another story, right? If they believe in his development, then great. He's perfect. The size and the fit, everything, defense, multi-positional, it's great. But if they feel like Delano Banton might still be like 2 or 3 years away and he needs more time in the G League, then I would just like to see them sign or either trade for or use the mid-level exception on a 1+1, either team option, player option, whatever, to sign a big guard who can really do that. I really wouldn't have even minded Victor Oladipo, to be honest. I think that would have been an interesting fit for him. So Jeff asks, who do you see as our top 3 possible trade partners and why? So the first possible trade partner that I see for us is the San Antonio Spurs with Jakob Poeltl, right? I see a team that is clearly looking to bottom out. You don't trade DeJounte Murray if you're not looking to bottom out. They're looking for picks, right? If the Raptors are ahead of schedule and they know that they're having a good season and Christian Koloko is not quite where you want him to be and Khem Birch is still Khem Birch of last year and not bubble Khem Birch, then I could see potentially them swinging for something in Jakob Poeltl, especially if they think that they want to make a deep playoff run this year or they want to be soft contenders. I could see that, especially if the San Antonio Spurs are either sitting him or shopping him. He has a lot of value around the league, and I think he'd be a very serviceable big for us. Another option could be the Indiana Pacers. I know that a lot of Raptor fans have linked OG Anunoby for Miles Turner. I don't necessarily see that happening, but if the Pacers are looking to get super young, I don't necessarily think that Miles Turner doesn't fit into that. He's 25 or 26 years old. He fits into a rebuild around Tyrese Halliburton. I don't like teams bottoming out. But hypothetically, if the Indiana Pacers wanted to move off of something like Miles Turner, then could you entice them with a package around Gary Trent Jr. and a couple of firsts? I think you probably could. So that could be a potential trade partner. Another trade partner, just because of the existing relationship with Jeff Weltman, would be the Orlando Magic. Depending on how competitive the Orlando Magic intend to be next year, it seems like they have a player type that's very appealing to us, which is long, rangy type of players. If Jonathan Isaac comes back for Orlando and he looks anything like what he used to look like, and maybe they want to move off of him for whatever reason, maybe they think, hey, it's too much of an injury risk or whatever, then I could see the Raptors potentially wanting someone like him to play their center spot. I think Jonathan Isaac's awesome. I think he's an incredible defender. And if you're talking multi-positional, switch everything, shot blocker, rim protector, every single thing that you want Precious Achiuwa and Christian Koloko and all these guys to be, that's exactly what Jonathan Isaac already is. Not a great offensive player, but good enough, right? What he gives you on defense is special if he's healthy. So those are three trade partners I could see for the Raptors. John asks, what is the most important quality to look for in a player when considering whether to draft him? Number one is portability. I look for a player who isn't overly ball dominant or who has shown situations throughout their career to date, whether in high school they played on a really stacked team or international play, like maybe even in college they maybe played on a stacked powerhouse. I look for examples where they have played with other really good players and they've had to defer, and I'd like to see how effective they are at other things, because most likely rookies kind of come in a similar vein as Scottie Barnes came in as a third, fourth, fifth option on the team. They're not dominating the ball, and so I often look for something that I consider portability, which is how do you fit into different situations? How do you fit in when you only get 15% usage versus 35% usage? Someone like Keegan Murray, for instance, right? A guy who has shown as a freshman that he can be a bit of a role player because he was playing with Luka Garza, and we saw that, right? But then also a guy who has now shown that he can take on a huge offensive load. So I like that quality in players. I like physical tools that don't limit. So I don't want to see a guy fail a lane agility test. I don't necessarily care if they can lift very much, because I think that's fixable. But the agility, balance, coordination, that kind of stuff, how do they move? I'm a big buyer into that. I believe that. I'm not saying that if you don't move like Michael Jordan that you're going to be bad. I just like to believe that there's not a hitch and balance issue, because I think that can be a predictor for injuries as well. I like to see a statistical profile where I see improvements year to year, especially high school, college. It's very difficult when guys are transferring from one conference to another to gauge improvement, right? They might move to a weaker conference and suddenly their numbers balloon up. It's nice to see a guy stick in one place and get better as a team around him gets better. That I really like. Now, in terms of personal skills, and I know that this could be its own video, right? In terms of soft skills and things, I look for a guy who cares about winning. Call me crazy. I really want a guy who cares about winning. And if I'm investing a lottery pick in a player, and this is one of the big criticisms that I had of certain players over the last few years, I want a guy who loves basketball. I don't want a guy who can step away from basketball for 4 months and not touch a basketball for 4 months. I don't want that. There's plenty of places in your life to be balanced. This isn't one of them. I want a guy who's obsessed with basketball. And that's really what you had in DeMar DeRozan. It's what you have right now in Scottie Barnes. These are the guys who get better. Now, in the case of DeMar DeRozan, there's a limited upside to how much better he can get given, certain limitations within wingspan, player type, etc. But with a guy like Scottie Barnes, Kawhi Leonard, the fact that they love the game, they're just going to get exponentially better and they become great. So I really prefer that. And the final question, this one comes from David. Robert, what do you think of Scottie Barnes? Oh, never mind. Oh, I love that question. I think the world of Scottie Barnes, and I have affectionately said that if he's traded, God forbid, that I will literally move to the city that he is traded to, because I believe, look, I know this is a joke question, but it's a great way to end this video. And I want to just express very honestly how I feel about Scottie Barnes and why I feel like this is the type of player that you do not move for 10 picks, 5 picks, superstar. I don't care what it is. Because there are certain guys where they make other people better. And I think that's a really underrated skill to have in a franchise player. I think Magic Johnson made people better, not just on the court, but in practice. I think as a leader, he made them better. I think there are certain people, they're very special people, right? You bring those people into your organization and you win for 2 decades, okay? Their personality creates winning. There's no box score metric for it. It's not a rebound. It's not an assist. It's not a block. It's not something you can measure. It's not something analytics can track. It's an intangible quality. It's leadership. It's confronting issues when they come up. It's leading by example. It's knowing when to put your hand around a teammate's arm and when to yell at him. It's knowing these things. It's being professional. All of these things that Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, no offense to Kevin Durant, one of my favorite players, but Kevin Durant has not shown an ability to confront his teammates. Scottie Barnes will confront you. I've seen it. He's 20 years old as a rookie and he's already confronted several of his teammates. This is not a guy who likes to lose. This is not a guy who sleepwalks through practices. This isn't a guy who's late to practices. This is a guy who drives culture. And when he becomes your best player, he will be the person setting the mark for how intense practices are going to be. You don't want to be in that practice. You're going to be exhausted because he goes hard. And that's just who he is. And that's a very special quality that makes all the young players better. It makes all your fringe prospects pop. It's, in my opinion, why Tony Parker was as great as he was. Because of, I don't want to credit all of Tony Parker's greatness, but how many quick, exciting, athletic, creative point guards did we see come into the NBA and fizzle out from overseas? How many players like that? You cannot tell me that it's an accident that Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker, Kawhi Leonard, all these guys became so great while Duncan was there, and suddenly the Spurs draft year after year after year after year, and if they haven't played with Tim Duncan, they haven't gotten exponentially better. You lose a special person like that, you lose that type of person, it doesn't work anymore. There's a lot of examples of players like that, okay? They're not always superstars. Sometimes they're veteran role players like Andre Iguodala. Sometimes they're veteran guys like Thaddeus Young. These are special people. They're not just special players. Now, when the special person is also a special player, then you have Steph Curry. Then you have Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Tim Duncan, the greatest of the greatest to ever do it, Bill Russell, okay? And I'm not saying that Scottie Barnes will get there one day, but I think he'll get really close. So this has been a very special edition of the Raptors podcast, weekly podcast. I'm happy I got to get to some of these questions, although some of them I've apologized, they're a little bit late. Drop some questions down in the comments below for next week's mailbag. I'll put this up on Facebook and see what else we can get. We're heading into Summer League. Really excited to see Christian Koloko play. Really excited to see, hopefully, Delano Banton, David Johnson, all these guys are going to play. Justin Schimpeni. Nice to see what they're going to add. Of course, Scottie Barnes is going to be there. He's not going to be playing, but he's going to be there hyping his teammates up in Vegas. I know he wouldn't miss that. So I'm looking forward to the Raptors season. I'm really excited about Otto Porter Jr. I'm really excited about this team. I think that they're much better than they're getting credit for right now. And while I don't think they're going to be a championship team next year, I do think they're going to be a really scary out in the playoffs if all things go well. Hit that like, subscribe. If I hit a comment, if I hit a note that you really don't agree with, drop it in the comment below. It really helps the algorithm. If I said something you really do agree with, by all means, let me know that as well. If you have any video ideas, sorry to keep peppering this. If you have any video ideas for me to do, drop that in the comments below, and hit the like, hit the subscribe, hit notifications, all that good stuff. And for sometimes funny content, follow us on Instagram at Pensari Basketball. My name's Robert. Thank you so much for being with us if you stuck to the end, and have a good day or good night. Peace.